Welcome. My name is Steph Abrar. I'm from Public Health England's Public Mental Health team, where I lead on prevention and promotion and advise on workplace mental health. A warm welcome to all of you joining us today from up and down the country for our webinar on workplace mental health and wellbeing. This week marks Stress Awareness Week in a year that has been one of the most stressful on record, and this week has been yet another groundbreaking opportunity to experience stress. There never has been a more important time to share what we know about workplace mental health during emergencies and draw on our collective experiences to date. So we have an impressive lineup of speakers for you today. Let me introduce you to them. We have Dr. Sonia Wallbank, Director of Human Resources and Organisational Development from the Department of Health and Social Care. Jan Montgomery, Clinical Supervision Manager, Able Futures. And Professor Neil Greenberg, Consultant Psychiatrist and Chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists Special Interest Group in Occupational Psychiatry. So following our short presentations, we'll have 20 minutes for discussion. So speakers, please keep to time so that we can take questions. And audience, if you could write your questions in the chat bar as we go along, my colleague Alex Williams will be monitoring questions for us. And just to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded and the replay link will be shared with you within 24 hours. And lastly, you may find a series of rather useful links popping up in the chat bar, and you'll be able to download these as we refer to a particular document or a published paper. So before we start, I'm going to give you a little bit of context in terms of my presentation. So Rob, if you wouldn't mind putting on the slides for me, please. Excellent. So next slide, please. So mental health at work has always been a big issue. 1 out of 6 of us experiences a common mental health problem such as anxiety or depression in any week. Now this slide is pretty old actually, and I think one of the most important points about it is that things are changing in terms of days lost and proportions of sickness absence. So next slide please. What is actually happening is that over the past several years we've seen a steady rise in stress, anxiety and depression, as you can see from the graph. Higher rates than ever before, with massive 17.9 million days lost, as opposed to the nearly 15 million days lost reported in the previous slide. And mental health at work accounting for 51% of new and long-standing cases of ill health, according to self-reported data in the Labour Force survey for the last financial year. Factors driving this increase have been general workload pressure, tight deadlines, too much responsibility, and a lack of managerial support. So COVID might have just affected the tail end of the data, but it wasn't really responsible for the rise that we see. Next slide, please. But what about the impact of COVID? How has the virus itself, lockdown, the start of recession, affected our mental health? PHE's new Mental Health and Wellbeing Surveillance Report summarises near to real-time data, drawing together a range of data sources such as surveys and helplines data to draw conclusions. The first publication of this was in September, and we expect November's very soon. What it shows is that in April, we saw a sharp decline in mental health, and then there was an improvement over the summer as lockdown was lifted, but it has not returned to baseline, which was 2017-19. And it's too early to say if we're seeing increases in recent weeks. The data hides variation. So those that are disproportionately affected according to the data that's being collected are young adults and women who report worse mental health and well-being, adults with pre-existing mental health conditions who have reported higher levels of anxiety, depression and loneliness, adults who are not in employment before or since the lockdown were more likely to report worse and increasing loneliness, high levels of anxiety and mental distress. Also affected those on low incomes and low socioeconomic position, people with long-term physical health problems, living in urban areas, living with children, those who have coronavirus-related symptoms. And the data on ethnicity is inconclusive. Sample sizes are quite small and often correlated with other variables like being a key worker, having a low socioeconomic position. I would also add that other evidence reviews we've done at PHE suggest that those bereaved, those shielding, key workers, those with cognitive impairments and carers are also affected. Next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the data we've been collating on anxiety. It comes from 2 data sources, the UCL study and the ONS study. They use different measures but show broadly the same trend. So the red dots on the left of each of the graphs are the baseline, and the week 12-13 is the first lockdown, with week 38 being the end of September. The overall pattern is a peak of anxiety and distress during lockdown in April, and this peak reduces in the summer but never goes back to baseline. And as I said before, it's too early to say, to be sure, whether we're seeing increases in these recent weeks. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show you the slide by gender on anxiety, and this shows a known patterning of anxiety by gender, with women more likely to experience it during the coronavirus. There have been a range of different reasons, however, some of which might be even greater than usual additional caring burdens. Next slide, please. So how does this translate into employment? There isn't an awful lot of published data out there yet. For this slide, I've drawn on our own experiences, the CIPD's workplace survey in June 2020, and the expertise of public health colleagues around the country. So it's not comprehensive, but it provides some pointers to possible challenges for us all. The key issue emerging from the CIPD survey is work-life balance and job insecurity. Working remotely from home, IT and tech issues, fatigue, which is physical, emotional and cumulative, workload pressures. These are all drawn from our experiences, but workload itself in the CIPD survey shows that this is particularly acute for key workers. Although, for example, for other staff, those who are furloughed, too little work may also be part of the picture. Isolation, lack of social connection, dealing with traumatic events are all part of this picture, as well as the simple challenge of getting our staff to take leave. Risk groups are the ones we've identified in our COVID study, as we spoke about before, but staff in particular occupations, key workers, care home staff, teachers, staff with long-term conditions, low-paid staff, staff experiencing domestic violence, BAME staff, so Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff also. And next slide, please. Just drawing your attention really to who is disproportionately affected by a lack of good work. We know that good work is very much correlated with mental health. So who is on insecure contracts? Who is getting low pay? Who's got a second job, 0 hours, temporary contracts and shift work? All of these things are disproportionately experienced by BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers, and you can see more on the reports released this year from the Carnegie Trust and the King's Fund on the experiences of inequality in the NHS. Next slide, please. Absolutely key in finding out what the issues are for your workforce are surveys, as we found also. The picture will vary depending on your culture of psychological safety, your line manager capability, training, support systems that you have in place. If you aren't already doing a survey, this 10 questions simple one from what works in wellbeing is a really good start, and it gives you some benchmarks and some baselines to work with. And obviously communicating and engaging about the findings is key. Next slide, please. PHE has a range of workplace tools and resources, and I don't have time to do them justice, but we have an overview toolkit for mental health based on the Farmer and Stevenson Thriving at Work report and the existing evidence base, which I still think is useful during these times. So it's about making a commitment to mental health. It's about building your approach, updating your policies, creating a positive culture, supporting social activities and communicating about well-being. It's about providing support and training, providing line manager training, building into inductions. So if you're somebody like me who joined the organisation during lockdown, you may never have met your colleagues, which is a very strange experience, but taking all of that into account and compensating for it. Manage mental health, so being proactive about tackling the stigma that prevents people from talking about this issue, openly discussing it, and supporting employees with reducing stress, so using like the HSE management standards and tools, which are very useful. Providing the right support and making adjustments. So all of our speakers today are going to give you far more detail about these particular issues. So next slide, please. We have a range of workplace toolkits. They do cover some of the issues that are kind of coming up and will come up as the recession really kicks in. So for example, suicide prevention. Suicide is very clearly linked to unemployment, and it may be something we have to deal with in the workplace, and it's always worth being prepared. Sleep and recovery. Sleep has been a big issue. Drugs and alcohol. Alcohol is always linked to recessions. Domestic abuse. So these toolkits, I think, are very relevant still. Next slide, please. psychological first aid. We've developed in PHE a really good psychological first aid tool. It's free, it takes 1 hour, and it's on Future Learn. So it's really about, it's useful for everyone in dealing with the emotional impact of COVID-19. Although I would say this is not a substitute for line manager training. Over 80,000 people have signed up so far. Next slide, please. And lastly, Every Mind Matters, PHE's digital platform for looking after your mental health, jam-packed with the most up-to-date advice and signposting. So thank you very much. That's all from me. I hope I've given you a bit of a context to the topic. And over to you now, Sonia Wallbank from DHSC.
Hi, thanks, Steph. The wonders of technology. In and out she drops. So I'm a consultant psychologist by background, and the brief presentation I wanted to give you today was regarding the work that I've done between March and September to look after the health and wellbeing for NHS staff across England. So as you will probably be aware, our baseline for starting with NHS staff was we weren't in a great position anyway. So lots of burnout and stress and the workload that Steph was just talking about, very high. So the demands of people were all very high as we went into that first wave of pandemic. I wanted to go to a poll before we start, because I was really interested actually in thinking with you about how well your employers looked after your mental health. Would it be okay, Rob, if we can go to the poll? So if 1 was not very good and 4 was and 5 is very good, where would you be? Conscious we've got a range of employers today. Okay, so that's looking pretty healthy. So much more scoring the 3 and over, with some people scoring there with the 1 and 2s. I think that's better news, Neil, than we'd probably have seen across the NHS work if we'd asked workers at the beginning of the pandemic how well they felt looked after. Okay, if we can have the next slide, please. So what we did initially, pulled a whole range of professionals who'd had experience of working in pretty critical situations and thinking about what will our staff need at this point through a pandemic response. And we worked with people who'd responded to single incidents, so major bombs, threats, the fires, that type of incident, as well as people who'd had experience of working with those teams deployed to support Ebola, the 9/11 team, so where response would be needed over a longer period of time. And we had some excellent help from our military colleagues who would be dealing with this sort of tough exposure and expectation on a day-to-day basis. And what we drew together was this framework around prepare, active and recover. So the preparation stage in sort of March, April time, dependent on where you were in the country, we were seeing what was happening in China, seeing what was happening in Italy, and our anticipatory anxiety, what's coming next. A little bit like we were talking today about watching America politics unfolding, what's coming now? We're all starting to get a bit nervous. So messaging our staff teams was very much around, we're in this together, it's going to be tough, but we've got your backs, making sure that through the system, both in regional and local organisations, that staff teams were being prepared and understood what was going to be expected of them, and working with hospitals who were already in the eye of the storm to really share information on a day-to-day basis about what was happening and how they can prepare. So with the intention of reducing that anticipatory anxiety. We then went into this sort of peaking. Again, we're going into that now during wave 2. So you see a lot of extra activity across hospitals, teams being very stretched, of COVID admittances happening. Now, what we know about that phase is that it's very difficult for people to pay attention to their own health and wellbeing needs. So the NHS workforce tends to be a workforce that doesn't really take care of itself, because its whole primary function is to take care of other people. And so what we needed to make sure is that we'd got other people nudging, prompting, supporting for people to go off shift, to take their time off, to disconnect from the workplace. And any of you who've been involved in that sort of real flow of work that you're really passionate about, stepping back and away, it's almost that fear of missing out, and it's a very intense experience. So you build great relationships with your team really quickly, but disconnecting can be as important as then plugging back in to recharge. We then had our recovery phase. Now, unfortunately, our recovery phase has not been long-lived, but what we've tried to do really between July and August is make sure that we were talking to people about how can you take your annual leave? What period of time can you have away from the workplace? How can we redeploy you perhaps into work that doesn't demand so much of you for this period of time so that you can rest and recover? And give people the opportunities through decompression sessions, conversations, supervisory discussions about what have I been through, what's been the impact to me, again with the whole purpose of keeping as many people well and not suffering long-term mental health impacts as possible. If we can have the next slide, please, Rob. So really just a brief pictorial about as we were going through the peak of the active phase, of course, staff are being impacted. The first one being just the actual exposure of events. What have people been through? What have we exposed people through? And as the physical demands lifted, as we go into the second period of recovery, it leaves people that space and time for psychological thinking about, wow, what have I just been through? We've then been through a period of time where the system activity picked back up, so all the elective surgery and stuff was put back online. But actually now we're out of the eye of the public. The clapping has stopped, but the work is still there. People are still working as hard, but maybe not so rested and recovered. And then, of course, we're now in that sort of third shock wave where we've got the ask again, you know, come on, guys, we've got to go again. But actually, so that screening of staff, that paying attention at a local level, making sure that we know who in our teams need additional support is a critical time at the moment. Thanks, Rob. If we can have the next one. So what did we do? We put on a range of national offers. Key messages for us was choice, give people as many doors as possible to seek help. And the messages, again, because of the way that our workforce doesn't really seek help, is talk to somebody, anybody, doesn't matter who it is. Here's some anonymous spaces, both through our support lines, specialist bereavement services that you can talk to. Week in, week out through the peak phases, we've run a series of health and wellbeing webinars to keep the system updated on what the latest evidence was coming through. And one of the things that we've noticed about our workforce
I think we might have lost you, Sonia. Is it just me, or can we not hear Sonia? Sonia, I don't know.
I can't hear her either. I think she's frozen. Should we move on to the next and come back to?
Yeah, possibly.
Probably most of the way through hers.
Yeah. So Jan, do you want to start, and then we can always go back to Sonia and pick up?
Yes, certainly. So hello, my name's Jan Montgomery. I am Clinical Supervision Manager at Able Futures. So Able Futures is part of the DWP's mental health support service. So, you know, we've heard a lot this morning about the the difficulties that people are experiencing with their mental health throughout COVID, throughout lockdown, and Able Futures is here to help. So we are here to support anybody who is struggling with their mental health that is affecting them within the workplace. So I thought this morning that actually one of the things that would be really nice to do is to actually think about our own mental health. Because now more than ever, we should be looking after our own mental health. There's nothing like a global pandemic to actually focus our minds on what we can do to support our own mental health, to support our life, and our lifestyle has a huge impact on our mental health. So I'm actually going to invite you to have a look at your own life wheel. And this life wheel has got 8 sections. Some life wheels you'll look at will actually have 10 sections. So there can be, you can add in environment and you can add in spirituality. But really the idea of a life wheel is just to have a look at it and kind of give yourself a bit of a score for each individual section from 0 to 10. So it's not asking you to go into any details straight off. It's just saying, here's a little tool that might give us a bit of an indication of what's going on for you right now. So just quickly have a look at that and think, well, am I a 0? Am I a 10? Am I sitting somewhere in the middle? Just have a look at it for each individual section, because it's really important for us to be aware of what's actually going on in our own lives right now. What I tend to do with people when I'm doing this is ask them to put little dots on the wheel. So if you're scoring 0 or 1, then the dot is going to be practically right in the centre of the wheel. And if you're going to give yourself 10 out of 10 for fun, then you would actually have the dot right to the outside. And then it's quite interesting to join the dots and see what that looks like. Because depending on where you are, it might be interesting to think of it as being the front wheel of your bike. So if you've got 0s and 1s, then you're going to have a tiny little wheel on the front of your bike. So you're going to have to pedal heck of a hard to get anywhere at all. But if you've got all 10s, then actually you're going to have a pretty easy ride. So this is like the wheel of your life. For most of us, we probably have some quite low scores, some quite high scores, some scores that are in the middle, which actually means that the wheel of our bike is actually going to be a bit wobbly. So it's going to take huge amounts of energy and huge amounts of effort to get anywhere. And actually, quite often, if you've got a wobbly front wheel, then you're not really able to determine the direction of travel very easily. So the idea of the life wheel is just to give us a very quick overview of what is going on in your life right now. And every part of this life wheel will have an impact on your mental health. It will have an impact on your physical health. You know, we are born to connect. So if we can connect with friends and family, then we are really putting in some protective factors for our mental health. If we can have some fun in life, it's putting in a protective factor for our mental health. So this is just a very easy way of getting a snapshot of what's going on for us right now. And I'd really encourage you to have a think about your life wheel and see if there is something that you can do today or you can do this week that actually can increase some of your scores. But it's also really important to realise that actually, if you're giving yourself 10 out of 10 for fun, but actually 0 for work or 0 for friends or 0 for yourself, then maybe it's about bringing the fun score down a little bit in order to be able to concentrate and give more priority to some of the other sections, because this is actually about trying to find the right balance. It might be interesting to do this with some of your colleagues at work, setting yourselves little challenges and trying to find really creative ways of finding how you can increase your scores and increase your balance throughout your life. You could do it with a partner, you could do it with a team at work, you could do it with your family, you could do it with a friend. It's just a way of us being able to support ourselves and support each other, to look at our life and see if there's something in our lifestyle that we can work towards improving. I suppose from that, then I'm really going to be saying that, yes, at Able Futures, we can actually support you. Anybody who is having a mental health issue that is preventing them from functioning well within the workplace, and most of us may fit into that category at the moment because we are living through a global pandemic, there is support available through Able Futures. Now, for some of us, we may be coping really well because we may have a really robust social network, we may have learned and built lots of resilience, but actually for many of us, that is just not the case. So what do we actually offer? What we offer is one-to-one personalised support from one of our VRCs, so our vocational rehabilitation consultants. They're all trained in mental health. So most of them are therapists, or they are occupational therapists or mental health nurses. They are not there for counselling purposes. They are there to really focus on what is it that's going on in your life and in your mental health that is preventing you from really functioning well within the workplace. So you would have monthly appointments with your vocational rehabilitation service. It is absolutely free, and the service lasts for 9 months. So you would have check-ins once a month. You may be given some techniques. You may actually be signposted to a service that actually is more appropriate for your needs. So this is about really supporting your mental health in a broad terms. I'm not saying that we are all things to all people. We really can help with techniques and tools and skills. And really, we would be encouraging you to work on some of those tools and techniques between sessions. You would be sent resources, which you could then talk about having worked through some of them with your vocational rehabilitation member of staff at your appointment. So that's what we offer, 9 months of free support. We also support employers if employers are looking to have somebody come in to talk about mental health, and there are some files that will show you the support that's available for individuals and support that's available for managers and employers. And that's our phone number, that's our website address. And please, if you're struggling or if you feel as if you could do with some support for your mental health, then get in touch. We would be absolutely delighted to offer you that support and to work alongside you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jan. Yes, Sonia, sorry we lost you, and sorry that we've leapfrogged over you. So you were just talking about staff wellbeing and the interventions you'd put into place. Do you want to just take us through that?
Yeah, so we can go through to the next slide. Sorry, a bit disjointed now, but just to say all of our national offers were designed to support and supplement all of the work that our local organisations are already doing. So in terms of having employee provisions via occupational health and other teams, counselling services. I guess what we'd learned from our previous responses for the bombing and Ebola and that type of thing that I talked to you about is that the more choice you can offer people, the more likelihood it is that they will access. And sometimes people do feel really comfortable coming away from their workplace in order to be able to access that help. what we've put into place, and I've in the offers section on the site today, you can have a look at our people.nhs UK resources. There's loads of hints and tips there around supporting yourselves as line managers, really understanding mental health responses through the pandemic, is right from self-help through actually talking to somebody, up into the more intensive support and interventions. We know that we will have a range of staff who maybe will need some additional support. We will have staff who need specialist mental health intervention, but actually the more staff that we can get talking, sharing, decompressing with each other, the less likely we are to get into crisis mode. So that full range of support and local, regional, national offers was really important to us. And Rob, if we can just have the final slide. So just to let you know, the app download, so Headspace, Sleepio, and a range of other free apps that some organisations have kindly opened up to staff, have been really popular with over 154,000 downloads. We've had over 8,500 now calls with the dedicated helplines, and that's been absolutely great for the national teams to really understand what's going on in the workplace and what staff needs. So totally echo the point that Steph was making earlier about, you know, surveying staff, asking them what's happening, really keeping close to them. And the idea of secondary stresses, it might not be the workplace that's actually interfering with people's mental health. There are so many ranges in terms of those secondary stresses. So the financial pressures, as we've gone into lockdown again this week, the relationship pressures that may need just some support from the workplace to handle. And then I've shared the slides, but the next couple of slides, there's just some resources there for you. So one on the stress arc, again, great opportunity for you to think about how often am I in the green zone. It's fine to go into the red zone, but you might want to go on holiday there. You don't want to go and live there. And the next slide is, there we go, just helping you think about the ways in which you cope and what the evidence base tells us about some are better than others. So harmful ways of coping right the way through to those more helpful and some of those useless ones. And again, not to say that we don't get caught up in the different ways of coping, but just from an evidence-based perspective, what has a longer term better impact. And then finally, just thinking about those factors that we know reduce the impact of stress. And beyond everything, it's that relationship that you have with your local line manager, your local team, that will protect you during these experiences. So really working hard to be getting on and gelling as a team. Thanks, Steph. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And now over to Neil, Professor Neil Greenberg, who's going to give us his presentation.
Thanks very much indeed. That's great, and delighted to be here. So I've already been introduced, but basically my role over the past, say, 7 or 8 months has been to try and help out NHS England a little bit. I've had the pleasure of working with Sonia, and also we carried out quite a lot of research from our team at King's College London. And my background is in the military. If you're interested in what I'm saying, here's my Twitter handle. Please do follow me. I try to pump out all the research that we do on that Twitter handle when I can. And my interest for many years has been how do organisations manage trauma and stress. And of course, whilst we don't want a pandemic, this has been a very busy time for me and the team I work with out of King's College London. All the information that I will talk about is all available on these different websites. I think these slides will be shared, so you'll be able to sort of find how to get there. This is our Health Protection Research Unit, which has done an awful lot of work, both related to staff support, but also to sort of public behaviours as well. So there's no doubt during the last 8 months or so that we've all had some difficulties. There's been traumatic exposure for some of us. Unfortunately, we know lots of people have died. Our workload and shift patterns have changed quite dramatically, and you've probably heard it said, I like the phrase, it's not so much working from home, it's more sleeping in the office. And certainly, you know, many of us have completely lost that ability to know when we're at work and when we're not. Good evidence, Steph very nicely sort of set it out about things at home impacting upon people's mental health. You know, we know that financial pressures, difficulties with education, health, and worries about the future have really impacted upon many people's home lives. And of course, just as Sonia mentioned as well, that then becomes a secondary stressor, and it leaches into the workplace and affects people's performance and well-being there. There's also been this topic of what's called moral injury, and moral injury is where you're put in a situation where you find that what's happening to you or what's going on very much clashes with your moral or ethical code. So you haven't been able to deliver the quality of output that you're used to. You haven't been able to support a colleague in the way you'd want to because you can't go and see them. And what happens here is that moral injury leads you to a situation where you can feel really shameful, really guilty, or really angry that something hasn't happened. And that makes you vulnerable to develop mental health problems. And there are ways, and we'll mention just at the end of my talk, about how you might manage moral injury, because I think it's an issue for many people in lots of different roles. In terms of what you can do to try and prevent mental ill health, well, there's a number of things that you can do to prepare staff, and Sonia touched on some of these in her presentation. We don't support the use of psychological health screening. So there is no evidence that actually using people like me or Sonia to come along and sit down with someone to try and look him in the eye and work out whether they're fit to do the job, that just doesn't work. People don't tell the truth, and you then get a false sense of security that actually you've seen that someone's okay and they're going to be fine when they're not. Good study done in the Australian police showed a 7-year follow-up of psychological screening before police officers joined had no impact at all. It didn't predict anything. But it is really useful to ask people to consider whether they're up for the role. So if you're asking them to move into a particularly high risk or difficult area, or they're working on a task which is very much outside their normal scope of activity, then actually, if you've given them the right information and you haven't sugarcoated it and you've told them, you know, this is going to be tough and appreciate that you're the right person, but I'm not trying to lie to you, that it's not going to be easy, then people can make their own decisions about whether they're right to do that task or not. Very nice sort of phrase that's come out over the past sort of 8 or so months is this phrase, psychological PPE. These are the things that you can do to keep yourself psychologically safe before you start to work on the next difficult project, or before you enter into lockdown 2.0, as we all are at the moment. And things here that make a difference are thinking about what you're going to do if you have a tough time. So what are the things that keep you psychologically well when life's okay? You know, that might be a piece of music, it might be where you go for a run, it might be who you speak to, even if it's remotely, it might be a sort of food, or even, dare I say it, the one glass of wine that you might have that might sort of particularly fancy. But if you work out the plan about what you'll do when you're distressed before you're distressed, you're more likely to use it. We all know that when we're distressed, we don't think very clearly, and we just think that things aren't particularly good. So you can turn back to that plan and make use of it. And the most important thing to prevent people from becoming distressed is to train them properly for the role. And we've got lots of evidence from different settings that actually people who feel that they are given tasks that are way outside their level of competence and responsibility, they are much more likely to suffer with mental health difficulties. What about when people are doing the tough work? So we know there's a really strong evidence base that social support, team support is really useful. So how do you make that happen? Well, one thing you can do is to buddy up people. You can say, right, Sonia, Pete, what I want you two to do is today, as all the other tasks you got, I want you to check in with each other each hour and to see how you're doing. So you can formally ask people to make supporting each other as a task for their day-to-day work, rather than just say, oh, if you've got a problem, do call someone, which is very vague and then people don't do it. The biggest evidence, though, comes in the form of shop floor supervisors. These are the people who manage day-to-day activity within any organization. So it might be the foreman, it might be the sort of the lead nurse on a team in a hospital, but it's not the CEO, although they're obviously important. It's the people at the shop floor supervisor level. And what we know is that teams who think that their immediate supervisor is supportive and looking out for them, they have 1/10 of the rate of mental ill health compared to teams who don't. And so what we need to be able to do is to empower supervisors to feel confident to have what we call a psychologically savvy chat. And that basically means that when you say to someone, oh, how are you doing? And they say, I'm fine, you need to get beyond fine, because fine could mean I'm okay, but it could also mean that actually I'm falling apart and I'm not doing very well, but I don't want to tell you. So good evidence from studies done both in Australia, and we've got a small pilot now. We're running some of this training for the NHS, And what we find is that actually when you give a relatively brief active listening skills training, supervisors move from not feeling too confident to feeling pretty confident. Over 80% of people at the end of an hour's training said they felt confident in to support, recognize, and to speak with people who are distressed. So once you've got that conversation going, then supervisors can do all the things that they normally do and help people solve problems. So that should go on as and when, and also at the end of a shift. You shouldn't just say to people, do come forward if you've got a problem. Also a good evidence base for peer support. These are formal training programs that often take a day or a couple of days. And what they do is provide in the workplace someone who you can speak to who's just like you. They speak the same language and they understand the context in which you work. We in the military, over the last 20 years, and our research from King's has shown that one program, trauma risk management, for instance, has got a really strong evidence base. It helps people access care more frequently. It helps mobilize social support, and it helps keep people functioning and not going sick, most importantly, which we've looked at. We've done over 13 academic papers on that. So peer support, formal peer support, can make a big difference. However, if you've got someone who is pretty distressed, what do you do about it? And actually the evidence here is mostly you don't need people like me. You don't need mental health professionals. Mostly you can manage these things within the team. Very good study done in the Israeli military. They did a 20-year follow-up study of troops who became intensely distressed in the first Lebanon war. They applied these PIES principles, I'll run through them in a second, and they found the more these PIES principles applied at the time people became distressed, the better their outcome was 20 years later on. And you don't get many 20-year follow-up studies. So these principles are, first of all, proximity. And what proximity means is that if someone's having a tough time, don't just say go home and take some time off. Instead, try and work out how you can support them in the workplace. How can you perhaps move their duties a little bit? How can you perhaps buddy them up a bit more with someone who's particularly supportive and good at mentoring? Because if you keep people at the workplace, within the workplace, even if that's remote these days, then actually there's much more chance they'll carry on. If they go off sick and just take the time they need, they worry what people think of them, they lose their social support, which we know is useful, and the chance of them getting back to their normal duties is much decreased. Immediacy says, if you've got someone who's having difficulties, make sure you nip it in the bud. Make sure that your buddies or your supervisors or your peers actually have an active chat with people. And as we said, don't just accept, oh, I'm fine as the answer. Expectancy says pretty much what sort of Steph covered, which is about the fact is many of us are having symptoms at the moment. Most people are not ill, formally ill, but actually if you've got someone who's not sleeping ideally, you're not concentrating, as you normally do, and you're a little bit more frustrated than you've been before, but actually you're getting on with life and things are okay, it's probably not that you're ill. And so the expectation is that if you're having symptoms, mostly they will pass with time and some good support. The other bit of expectancy is that if they don't pass, if you do get worse, if you start to get impaired and you can't carry on well, then you need to go forward and get some help. That's really important. And the last thing is simplicity, is that often when people are very distressed, simple things can make a big difference. So an active problem-solving approach can really help. If you've got a member of staff who's a healthcare staff, for instance, who's working on an intensive care unit and they don't normally work there, and they're really worried that they might not understand what the alarm means on a ventilator, or they might not know what to do, they don't need mental health support. They need supervision and mentoring to use that ventilator, understand what it does. And these simple things can make a really big difference. And then once people begin to come off the most intense part of the job, whenever this happens for the nation as well, really good evidence that actually having a thank you makes a difference. And actually saying not just, oh, thanks very much for what you did, but actually you, Jonathan, I really appreciate what you did on this particular task. And that thank you also gives a chance to actually give people information about all the different sorts of supports, perhaps the sort of supports if you're a healthcare worker that Sonia mentioned. People need a bit of time off. We often lurch from crisis to crisis, particularly lately. And actually, you have to give people at least a bit of time to get themselves back into a good place. And so don't just send people from one task to another. Supervisors, again, have a really important role trying to detect those secondary stressors, as Sonia mentioned. How will you know if someone's partner's lost their job and they're in financial difficulty if no one asks them? How will you know if actually mother-in-law actually unfortunately died of COVID if you don't ask those questions? And so that's, again, another reason why supervisors need to be able to chat to people. Time for reflection and meaning making. I mentioned moral injury. Well, moral injury often happens because you feel that someone didn't do what they should have done, or you didn't do what you should have done and you feel shameful and guilty. the best way to deal with that is for people to speak about that together, often led by a leader saying, let me start off by saying, I didn't get it right all the time. And actually everyone can then come to an understanding it wasn't anyone's fault, it was the situation that was the problem. And actually we did our best, even though it was difficult. Keep an eye on people and then get them to evidence-based care if they need it. So the end of my talk is just sum up these principles, which is don't over-medicalise normal distress, nip things in the bud, build team support as a priority with buddies and peers, and make sure that supervisors feel confident to have those meaningful, psychologically savvy chats. Use those PIES principles, say thank you, don't forget reflection, talk about how tough it is. No one's got all the answers at the moment. We're in it together, and keep an eye on people and get them to care if you need it. So that's me. And
thank you so much, Neil.
that's okay.
Thank you all. So hopefully we should have 15 minutes or so for questions. And I know there's been plenty of questions in the chat. So Alex, give us a couple of questions that have come up.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everybody for, there've been some great questions, and thanks to, I think it's who is it? Tess, who's been answering a lot of questions about Able Future. So thank you for answering those in the chat. Questions. We had a question from Kizzy Felstead, who said that she's interested to know whether there's been an increase in mental health issues amongst autistic people during this time, especially since this group are at significant risk of suicide. And following from that, people are interested to know if the rate of suicide has increased. I guess that's for you, Steph.
I can take that one. Yeah, we did do a review of autism back in July, and the mental health evidence around that. And at that time, there was mixed evidence. I think some autistic younger people were finding it easier during lockdown because they didn't have the same kind of social pressures that were expected of them that made life stressful. But equally, there were other pressures that routines, etc., were disrupted significantly. So it was mixed on that. But I think going forward, I think as, for example, of autistic children, for example, will be struggling at school because they will be in a very different environment, perhaps, to previous. In terms of suicide, was it suicide in relation to autism?
Yes, specifically, and then in general as well.
I don't think we have any established trends. That's something I'd have to go and look up. But I think there were some small clusters, but I'm not sure that has.
Yeah, I can just pop in there the steps.
Do.
Certainly give it a...
Oh, Neil, I think we might have lost you as well.
Oh, he's back.
You back?
Sorry, I faded. Yeah, sorry. I think the data on suicide, just to say, is that actually we haven't seen any sustained increase in suicide around the country. It's talked about a lot, and absolutely there is potential out there, but it's really important that the media lines of, suicide epidemic coming, actually, I'm not saying it's not, but we see no evidence of that so far. It's important that we don't create this.
Oops, I think we've lost you again.
Pandemic.
But yeah, I would echo that we don't have any evidence at the moment. So next question, please, Alex.
Let's have a look. So Charlene Butler has asked, what type of support would you recommend we could offer to volunteers who've taken time off due to the COVID restrictions?
Any of the panel would like to answer that one?
I think so. I think generally speaking, in terms of what helps to keep people's mental health in a good state, the things that I broadly mentioned in my talk will help for volunteers or for people who are employed. So what we'd want to try and do is to create that sort of sense of community. And what I hear very regularly when I give these talks is, oh, it's much more difficult to support people these days. And I would agree with you, it is more difficult, but it's not impossible. And actually, rather than wait to the weekly meeting that you might have with people to provide support, I would suggest that people check in with each other on a regular basis. Then that might be a couple of times a day for a couple of minutes if that's necessary. But what we're trying to do is to create this sense of social connectedness. And this is a bit of a cheesy phrase, but I strongly believe in it, is that resilience in organizations often doesn't lie in individuals, it lies between individuals. So what we're trying to do here is to recreate as best as we can that network of support, which perhaps for many volunteers is why they actually went and did that in the first place. So stay connected as much as you can, I would say, is the best answer for me.
Thank you. Alex, any other questions coming through?
Yeah, we've got quite a few. So Paul Vittles, I hope I'm saying that right, he said, are you studying what language helps or harms in the current climate? I've had many workers saying, why do they keep telling us that we're remote working when we just think we're working from home? We don't think we're remote, but they keep telling us that we're remote. So I guess it's just around that language being used.
Does anyone have a view on that?
It's not something we're studying, but definitely aware of the way in which we're referring to our group. So in our hospital staff, as an example, we've got a range of staff who are in hospital working, and then other staff that are able to do the work that they need to do from home, other staff who are shielding. And there's a real cultural difference actually that's being set up between the groups who are in hospital, the groups who are outside of the hospital, and then following the initial lockdown, trying to bring people back together. It's been really difficult. So I definitely think it's something we need to be paying more attention to, but it's just shorthand sometimes, isn't it, to describe the way that people are working rather than how they're working.
Yeah, I would add to that as well. I think language is important, and sometimes we have been a bit clumsy, I think, as a nation. And even the term social distancing isn't really what we mean. We don't want to be socially distant. We want to be physically distant. That's the key thing. And certainly from Sonia will know better than me, one of the things that happened during the first wave was many of the NHS staff were labelled as heroes. And certainly for my workers as with the military, and I know also from the NHS, actually that's a very hard label to accept, you know, because heroes are tough and they don't need any help and they carry on through the flames and the action to the end. And actually, you know, it's great to have respect, but perhaps it's not great to be called a hero.
Yeah, how does a hero go and seek help, pick up the phone and yeah, no, you don't.
Alex, any other questions?
So we had one from Ronald Mendel. He said, have the presenters' research uncovered the use of H&S risk assessments in identifying anticipated pressures on mental health and what measures can be adopted to mitigate against them? So I don't know if any of the speakers have any.
I think Sonia and Neil, both of you.
Yeah, I wouldn't say particularly utilising the health and safety frameworks, but it's definitely something that all of our organisations have been encouraged to do, is to be assessing workplace risk and bringing in the kind of expertise about what do we think is coming next. So understanding that those staff, so PPE use is something I'm very familiar with now. The idea that the stressor, actually physical stressors on the body, of being donned in equipment all day, masked up, not just the dermatological impact of that, but the effect on your gait, sweating, all of those types of things. Obviously weren't foreseen at the beginning of the pandemic, but actually are coming more and more to the fore now. So just trying to thread through the workplace that sort of evidence about what's coming out, what are the potential risks, and knowing, of course, at the end of wave one, a lot of our staff are tired. They've maybe had some holiday, but probably not been off long enough to fully recover. And now we're going back in again. So the idea that there's a cumulative risk in what we're asking people to do is definitely on our minds.
Yeah, and I would second that. Certainly HSE, as you know, has got the workplace standards of stress. And so for years, they have been doing increasing amounts of work trying to get to a position where actually an inspector could actually go in and look at some organisations' capacity to properly mitigate the risks of stress. I think mental health and stress has played second place to physical health risks, certainly in the past. But I know HSE is certainly interested in this. With the Society of Occupational Medicine that I'm a trustee for, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the CIPD put together a couple of months ago a workplace, it was kind of back to work sort of risk assessment, what managers should be thinking about. So that should be available on those websites pretty easily. But I think that the difficulty is with applying the standard HSE approaches, which I think are really good, is that of course the situation changes all the time. So once you get a risk place for going back to work, then the rates go up and you go off on lockdown. So I think what managers have to do is to be dynamic and to use those principles, absolutely, but actually to apply them in a flexible way.
And I think also in terms of home working risk assessments, it strikes me very difficult to do and challenging now. So good to have some processes. Jan, did you have anything to add to that one?
It's difficult, especially when people are working from home and there's not that connection, because we all put on faces when we're on camera, don't we? Or we're having conversations. It's often much easier to pick things up when you are actually in connection with somebody, because you're seeing them when they are off camera as well. And it's very difficult to do that. And that's why really having the ability to be able to speak to somebody, not necessarily within the workplace, but outside of the workplace, can be really hugely valuable.
Thank you. Alex, do we have time for a final couple of questions?
Sure. So there's a couple of questions around mental health first aid in the workplace. Should it be made mandatory the same way as physical first aid? And if there's any specific training you would encourage employees to deliver to their managers and frontline supervisors to make people more psychologically savvy?
So,
Wow.
go.
I think we've all got a view on that.
Yeah, so I think I'll start off. But so I think I can say without being conflicted that I think the evidence on MHFA as a process that definitely helps in the workplace is pretty limited. I think its intent is absolutely right, which is to raise awareness in the workplace and to get people talking. I think when you look at whether there's been lots of studies done, and actually there has been a complete failure to show that it leads to any sort of positive effect for employees, although I'm sure it helps in some ways and helps change culture. There are other ways, and this is where I become conflicted because I run a company that provides some of these trainings, so I won't mention any particular names, but there are other peer support systems out there, and there's also a variety of ways of training your managers to have active listening skills. Steph mentioned the PFA module that Public Health England make available for nothing, that's online. We're looking at the evaluation to see what impact that has, but I'm confident it won't do any harm, and it certainly won't cost you anything. And so I think what you need to do is to think about a relatively short package of support to managers, because the evidence is really strong that study done in Australia with firefighter managers has shown that they did a randomized controlled trial, which is a really high quality evidence trial, and they showed that for every £1 invested in active listening skills training for managers, it saved £10 in sickness absence over the following 6 months. So I think there's a really strong argument for getting that active listening skills training for managers.
Sonia, did you have a view? What's happening at
Yeah,
within the NHS?
I'm less conflicted than Neil might be. So my personal view again is that mental health first aid training is great for raising awareness. I'm not so sure of the evidence of it being an intervention and providing change in that way. I think for me there are many. So Mind and the Samaritans all run these types of workplace training. Samaritans have got a great online resource for workplace training. The React training that Neil's provided now across the NHS is fantastic for a sort of 10-15 minute discussion. And I think the briefer that you can make it and the more enabling of this is a human to human conversation that we're asking people to have. There's no special training or secret. It's just enabling people to feel confident that once they open that box, they can have a conversation and close that down comfortably and have some extra skill to be able to do that.
Jan?
We also deliver training, just kind of a brief training on what to look for, what kind of things that you could actually have conversations about, how you can do that safely, and that is available. And as I say, there is a file there to show that. But really, it is about actually helping people to understand that mental health is about all of us. It's not about, this is how other people with mental health feel. We all need to be looking after our mental health. And I think that's when it comes to thinking about language, it's so important. It's not an us and them. It's we all need to be looking after our mental health. No matter what our role is within a workplace or an organisation. And I think that is really crucial, because I think that in itself will help break down some of the stigma around talking about mental health. It's about all of us.
Excellent. So I think what we're saying is not mandatory and not mental health first aid, but focused on listening and also awareness raising, anti-stigma. Very useful. One last question, Alex, and then I think we might have to call it a day.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions about how we support mental health for people in the arts and music industry who are working alone or in small groups that cannot meet, and how to support mental health support in the arts industry. So obviously they're not.
Neil, do you want to take that one?
I will, but I'll kind of be a bit of a broken record, really, in the same as what I said before. Is that I think if we look at what the evidence says works, and I'm no expert on arts. You can see Lego in the background; it's not mine, I promise. Then what I can say is actually the more connected that you could keep people, the better it is going to be for them. And so actually, I don't know whether you can do online artistic projects using remote means, but I suspect you probably can. So maybe you have to find alternative ways to try and recreate as best we can the social networks between people. Because for the vast majority of us, if we feel that someone understands us and we've got someone to talk to and we can mank and moan when we need to, actually that keeps us pretty psychologically healthy.
Okay, Jan, sorry, do you want to come in?
And access able futures. If you are employed, or if you are self-employed, or if you are an apprentice, then you can access able futures, and that will encourage you to connect with somebody else, but it will also encourage you to look at lots of other things that can support you while you're working as an individual within that field.
Okay, brilliant. And with that, I'm afraid I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Alex, for capturing the questions. And thank you to all our speakers for such brilliant presentations. I'm sorry that we've not been able to answer every question, but you'll be receiving the link to this replay by tomorrow or later on, and you'll be able to see all the different references provided. So thank you all for attending today, and have a very good weekend.